So we're just going to begin with an oddly straightforward archaeological story, and that is news of the Havering Horde, or as you so correctly reminded me yesterday, hordes by some measures. These are weapons, tools, or even a form of currency. We'll come to that in a moment. That's been uncovered, uh, and well, they're on display at the Museum of London Docklands. And you found this particularly just pleasing. You seem to find this a nice wholesome archaeological story.
Well, I think it's first of all, it is a cracking archaeological story.
Hmm.
It's a cracking find. It is effectively, if you look at the background reporting, it's I think four separate deposits
Mm.
of Bronze Age tools, axe heads, spearheads, fragments of other of tools, weapons, knives. Um, 453 objects in total. They've been dated to the late Bronze Age, round about 900 to 800 BCE,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they appear to have been deposited uh, in association with some form of ring ditch structure,
Hmm.
which again it's hypothesized has a ritual element to it. Um, isn't it always hypothesized that there's a ritual element to it?
Yep. Yep.
Um, by some at least.
Yep.
There are other views. Other views of buried deposits of hoards are available.
Are available. Yeah.
Um, yeah, um, and it was excavated as part of an archaeological condition on a development site.
Hmm.
It's a company called Archaeological Solutions Limited, who then worked with Historic England and the Havering Museum, and lastly the Museum of London,
Hmm.
to bring the hoard to the public, and it's now on exhibition under the title "The Havering Horde: A Bronze Age Mystery."
Yeah.
Because it's a mystery because it's still doing the post X basically, but
Yeah.
it's a great find.
Well, yeah, and as you say, it won't be going on display for a little while. It's going to be coming to the museum in April. But it looks as though,
Beg your pardon, yes, okay.
well, it's okay, but it looks as though this find has a couple of positives from an archaeological perspective, and one thing that I'd like to just sort of mention and discuss as well from I guess an archaeological news perspective. In particular, I like the way that they go out of their way to highlight, and indeed the BBC kept the quote in their article that this also underlines the importance of planned assessment and excavation in archaeological hotspots when new
Well,
development
this is the
comes
elephant
along.
in the room, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Because most hoards that are discovered by metal detectorists and do not have their archaeological context.
No, no, they don't. No, and well, actually, this is something. Actually, I can't remember. I don't think we have we? We haven't touched on this in any other sections this month. So we might as well bring in the old adage of "I was out looking for my wedding ring."
I, I was going to save that for next month actually, because I think there's a
Okay.
discussion, a much longer discussion to be had about that one.
Okay, well, so we'll tell you what, we shall save it though, but I guess we can just touch on this as a stereotype. I was out looking for my wedding ring,
Yeah.
and lo and behold, I came across a hoard. Goodness me! And this idea of the of
Shock horror. Oh, and by the time I was aware it was a hoard, I'd already dug out 300 objects.
I was down to my shoulder with my arm in the ground, and I,
And even
well,
though the Code of Conduct for Responsible Metal Detecting says that if you're aware of a hoard, you should call an archaeologist as soon as possible.
yeah,
I know.
exactly.
I'm sorry.
No, 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 it's fine.
They're not.
Well, and this instance, this really highlights how in another context, in another part of the world, this would have been found in that way, and this literal context of the site may not have been quite so clear. So it is quite cool. But I suppose I'm also drawn to this idea of, so if you actually look at the photographs, let's just have a quick look on the Museum of Docklands website. The close-ups reveal certainly axes, and I guess you could use words like chisel and this kind of thing. But
Yeah,
also,
it's the classic Bronze Age material for people who aren't familiar or are familiar with it. It's the in fact it's the later period socketed axes and socketed chisels and things like that.
yeah, or was it looped palestave hand axe?
looped pole
Yeah.
staves, and all the rest of it. Yeah, I mean,
um,
and anyone, yeah. Apologies to any Bronze Age specialists out there who know the nomenclature better than I do.
well, actually,
But yeah,
I'm just going to check that. Let's just hang on, Pellis stave. Just make sure I'm not using it incorrectly because someone will.
pole stave, I think.
Oh, is it? Oh, well, I've already.
Yeah.
Yeah, pole stave. Well done, pole stave. Yeah. An early Bronze Age axe, common in the Middle Bronze Age in northern, western, and southwestern Europe. Okay, well done, well done. But nonetheless, the reason why I'm examining this a bit more closely is that this material includes seemingly, probably, well, it looks like, but basically a bubbly material that almost looks like it could be slag. Obviously, I can't comment on what it
Yeah,
is unless I knew I could hold it and look at it. It looks like it's
yeah,
got some broken elements of material. Some of the axes are cracked. Some seem to be
yes,
incomplete. There's a spearhead there I can see as well, I think. Um,
yes,
and so it's interesting because the reason why I said at the beginning is that this could be a form of currency is that eventually these axes become quite abstract. They look at the beginning of the Bronze Age or in the mid Bronze Age much more like axe heads. I particularly like those sorts of styles. But then eventually the openings where they would attach to a wooden handle open up. They become a bit more stubby and wide, possibly a bit blunter, possibly a bit less useful as a tool. And I find that fascinating as a sort of form of proto currency, and what leads to what has been dubbed the Bronze Age crash. The idea that actually we now find all this material in great big caches in the ground because at some points people who had a lot of bronze realized, oh, there's too much bronze. Bronze is far too common. We're not as special, or it is not as special as it once was. Let's bury it in the ground. That's one potential reason for these sorts of deposits, these mass deposits, especially of broken material. Because it's also interesting as well, isn't it, that often material that's deposited for ritual or for votive reasons is a little bit broken. I don't think you get the best stuff in the ground often, do you?
you. That's true. I mean, again, our viewer might be familiar with the perhaps the most famous UK example,
Mhm.
which is Flag Fen in Cambridgeshire,
Mhm.
where famously excavated by Francis Pryor and his team, and there you had a massive bronze material, much of which was broken deliberately, it would appear,
Mm.
before it was deposited in the fen, and you end up with, you know, in the end, it's all going to be theoretical because we don't have written sources for this,
No.
and so we're going to be surmising about what motive or mixture of motives actually
Mm.
led to these deposits. And it's certainly clear that throughout historical time, hoards of material have been buried for whatever reason.
Mhm.
It is striking that this material does not, it doesn't look like sort of flashy state of the art, immaculately produced, uh, working tools and so on, at
No.
least not all of it. And okay, we're only going from photographs that have been published now. It hasn't been fully analysed
No.
yet and reported yet, so we're guessing. I think it's going to be very, really, very, very interesting to compare this material and say the material from what is recognised most broadly as a ritual site like Flag Fen
Mhm.
with the everyday working tools from places like Mus Farm that have been published recently,
Mm.
where you've got wonderful survival of. There's a very striking image of a socketed axe that was excavated in situ, still with its hafting and fastening in
Mhm.
place.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's not how we're used to seeing this material. So comparing the two is going to be, it's as though you were only able to study the Middle Ages by looking at churches.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and with sites like Musfarm, we can now do proper comparisons,
I
and
think so.
that is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, in that sense, like, yeah, I mean, in another context, one might say comparing the religious to the profane, as it were. potentially, and
Yeah,
this kind of thing. Um,
yeah.
but
Although again, we have to recognise that in past societies, the sacred and the profane had a much closer and more complicated relationship than maybe they do in the 21st century.
Oh, yes,
Certainly in
without it.
Western Europe.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. It's also interesting because just like if you permit me, just to make another
Of
observation,
course,
into which is the if you think, thank you, my lord,
you're
is
being very
this.
polite this morning, Russ.
Like I said, I've been feeling delicate. I'm feeling polite. Um, but it's interesting that so at the end of, for example, if just going back to the BBC article, this question of
Yeah,
discovery also has huge importance due to deliberate placement of each of the deposits. It's incredibly rare to have uncovered four separate hoards of such size in one site. And it says here that one of the questions is why was it never recovered? And that reminds me of the Staffordshire hoard. In so much
mm,
as that was a hoard that had uh, from a cursory initial observation, similar questions. You know, this material has been damaged, it's been bent, it's clearly not, it's not there just to be melted down for a blacksmith, but it's also not pristine gift-giving material. And of course, we're talking about completely different societies. The needs and wants on the uses of treasure in, say, Saxon Mercia are utterly different as far as we can tell from Bronze Age London. But it's interesting how.
although having said that, if you look at things like the literary culture we do have of another Bronze Age culture, certainly in the Mediterranean, a Bronze Age warrior culture, you
Yeah,
do see parallels. It is the warrior chief who
the gift
gives
giving.
gifts
Mm.
to their comitatus, to their entourage,
Well,
to their clan or whatever, however they were organised.
this
You
is
know.
true. Well, and so the reason why I say it's completely different is that there's not the evidence for things like the specific comparisons, like things like mead halls and storytelling or
Yeah,
whatever. It's harder to make that direct link.
true.
But
That
you're
is true.
right. I mean, people who had the secret of bronze, we see people like the chap who was buried with the mould gold cape, for example, in North Wales. They undoubtedly had this gift-giving power, and that's almost certainly where their status came from.
Amesbury Arch is the other famous one. Is seen
Yeah,
as an aristocratic figure
yeah,
or an
exactly.
important socially important figure anyway.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
interesting how in both cases the question of why wasn't this recovered is one that I say we, modern people ask of this. There's always this, whenever, for example, I ask kids in a primary school context, you know, why would a Roman or why would Roman builders put coins into a wall? Their mindset is one of keep your wealth safe to retrieve it and spend it later, not that it does good in terms of being a spiritual bank account where you're hoping that the building stays up or you're donating, you know, to the underworld to try and, you know, placate the gods or something. It's interesting how
Mm.
that bias and this notion of, well, this is here to be recovered is probably one of the first things we have to get over when we examine this, I think. Um,
Absolutely. I'd cite examples of it on the former Western Front in Belgium and France.
mm,
The folklore of the buried, gold coins in in the farmhouse that was destroyed during World War I is a
hmm
current one. I've heard that from colleagues who've worked extensively in Belgium, for example,
mm,
and in Eastern Europe, the stories of houses that were occupied by Jewish families before World War II, which are then
mm,
taken apart by uh, local people after those families were deported during the Holocaust.
yeah.
There are recorded instances of that because they would have buried their wealth.
Mm,
That those biases and prejudices
mm,
and so on enter the culture. So it is a sort of universal that people who had wealth, certainly in a pre-banking era when it's not stored electronically in some or offshore in a computer server in Barbados or something.
mm.
Um,
Well,
then
they're perceived to bury it for that purpose,
precisely.
but I think what's interesting is that I think the evidence is quite strong that actually the further back you go, and even you don't have to go that far back. I mean, I'd say even in Saxon times, certainly in Iron Age Britain, it's obvious that people deposited material wealth for reasons other than
Yeah,
retrieving it later to spend or to save it from other people getting it. I think
yeah.
uh, it's And I think it's also true now. I mean, if you think about wishing wells, people chuck money into watery places all the time, without any real expectation of retrieving it. I mean, of course
and,
it's
and
retrieved. Of course the council uses it for whatever, but you
yeah.
see what I mean? This idea of it, it's passed out of common use and into something
Absolutely,
else.
if you look at the, yeah, and if you look at, for example, again, look, if we're looking for cultural parallels, potential cultural parallels,
Mm.
recognizing is a really dangerous thing to do. Um,
But
but
we do
hey,
it
let's do it anyway.
anyway.
Let's do it anyway. Let's stand in the middle of the academic motorway and wave at everybody. No, if you look at the tribes of the west coast of the USA and Canada,
Mm.
and the idea of the potlatch,
Mhm, mhm.
where a
Conspicuous
local
consumption.
you know, social leader
Mm,
will throw a massive party
mm, mm,
with the aim of consuming and actually destroying
mm,
part of their wealth.
mm.
The idea of the Greek the Greek feast where you end up throwing the plates into the fireplace,
Yeah, yeah.
or that it's the idea of showing how wealthy you are by destroying part of that wealth is something that also occurs in culture,
Yeah. Well, yeah. So in that sense,
in cultural situations.
yeah. And so in that sense, this doesn't have to be a spiritual or religious thing that we're seeing. It could simply be a case of I don't need this. Haha.
Yeah,
I'm so
or a mixture of
incredibly.
all those motives, actually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. In that sense, well, actually, I suppose another cultural comparison that we live within in the Western world that has sort of religious foundations in the Middle Ages and a little bit before then would be this idea of giving a reasonable amount to your religious organization. I mean, I think they call it tithing.
Tithe
Yeah,
is the
yeah,
most famous example of it,
yeah.
isn't it? Yeah,
So the idea that you give 10% of your income to the church
yeah.
is something that's I think is also comparable there. And whether you do it, it's one of those interesting things as well, where we also need to remember that the person doing the giving um, you can look at it from the outside and say, are you doing that for your own guilt? Are you doing that because the church tells you you have to? Or are you doing that because? And the answer will be an awful lot of that stuff together and more. And also crucially, they can't necessarily fully explain why they're doing it. It
Mm.
simply is something that they
Can
do.
I make it actually something's just occurred to me while you're saying that, Michael, and
Hmm.
it's a point I'd really like to
Hmm.
make, and maybe actually to begin to wind up this segment on as a sort of a thought to leave our viewer with.
Hmm.
Um, we perhaps because of the connotations of buried treasure and the treasure map and the fact we have the Treasures Act
Hmm.
and so on, it guides our thinking to the extent that we in the 21st century, or many people in the 21st century, might perceive the kind of deposits as inevitably clandestine, that it's
Ah,
something
done
done
in
in secret
secret.
to
Mm,
return to.
mm,
Whereas here we can pose the question: we have these four hoards that appear to be associated with a structure,
hmm, hmm.
and you can and at Flag Fen
A
again
very
there was a
obvious
structure,
structure.
a
Yeah.
very obvious
Mm,
structure. It's
mm,
a very obvious location
mm,
where and the suspicion has to be that this material was actually deposited in certainly some cases, maybe many cases at that particular period, in plain sight.
mm,
It's
mm,
part of general social discourse.
mm. Yeah.
And it's only later that we layer it with this kind of patina of buried treasure
Yeah.
and so on. There's a heck of a difference psychologically from burying treasure to stop somebody coming along to find it afterwards so that you can
Hmm.
come back and retrieve it, to showing your status, to showing your regard for the gods or whatever, by
Mm,
very publicly disposing of
mm, mm.
part of your cultural possessions. You know,
Yeah.
um,
Well,
I mean, I think we have to be very, very careful how we see these things.
no, I think you're right. But actually, as a flake, there's someone honking the horn in agreement there with you. Um, yeah, apparently.
Or say, "Shut up, Brockman! You don't know what you're talking about."
Possibly, maybe a Bronze Age archaeologist. Shut up! But actually, I guess just, I mean, you're right. We should wrap this section up. But I guess as an additional little flavour to that thought, if you think about a place like the Tower of London, actually, that is a place where material is kept, famously kept, safe. And isn't that a weird notion, actually, if you think about it? Everyone knows it's there. People can even see it and visit it, and they have a relationship with that stuff. But actually, is also highly protected because there's a generalized understanding of the function of it being safe and known about. It's interesting.
Just extending that example, look at the number of cathedrals
Hmm.
where the cathedral quote treasury is
Yeah.
put on display separately, and sometimes you even have to pay a separate ticket price to
Yeah.
go and see it. You know, it's it's a sign of status, but it's also a way of gathering visitors and maybe even gathering income from your visitors.
Hmm. Yeah. So all of this is
So,
floating around this. Yeah.
take themselves.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay.
But I think the key thing to finish on is that we've got, four effectively Bronze Age hoards excavated in context, fully dated. They're undergoing full, post text with those questions that archaeological information, um, with archaeological information in mind, and that's a rarity these days. So fantastic,
I think
really
so.
exciting.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think so.